Hello, I'm Meehan with Medpricer, and I'm here today with Joe Walsh, founder of Supply Chain Sherpas. We're going to talk a little bit about supply chain challenges and opportunities today. Joe, what do you see as the three largest challenges facing healthcare supply chains today?
Yeah, three largest challenges. Good question, by the way. The three largest challenges that I see facing the supply chain today. First is that supply chain is misunderstood. And when I say misunderstood, by the folks that largely manage supply chain, CFOs, could be chief operating officer, they're not asking enough of their supply chains. So if all we're asking supply chain to do is to save more money, that's one dimensional goal, and it should be there, but it's not alone sufficient. There's so much more that a supply chain can be and probably should be doing. So if you look at a value equation says, if you want something from any functional area in the business, it's all the things you get divided by what it costs you for that function. So asking a supply chain to just save more money, well, in exchange for what? Hopefully you're getting better service, you're getting better quality, you're getting better outcomes in the business. You can't just say, I want something for less without defining what you want for less. And so that's an unbalanced value equation. So my invitation to CEOs, the COOs, and the whole C-level suite is to ask more of the supply chain and to recognize its inherent potential of what it can do. In other industries, a supply chain is typically a strategic asset to the business. In healthcare, it is still trying to earn its way out of the basement. Bridging that gap is why I say it's still way misunderstood. Maybe challenge number two is that it's underinvested. When I was in Intermountain Healthcare, I used to get asked the question constantly. We were arguably invested more so than almost any other supply chain in the rest of the industry, which I was very grateful for. However, the question I used to get asked by our own leadership team was, well, how come you have more resources for the same amount of spend relative to your peer group? And in retrospect, I guess I probably should have even been a little bit more bold than I was at the time, because when you think about it, we were still only about 10 to 20% as invested as somebody like Procter & Gamble or Intel or McDonald's or other world-class supply chains are in investing in their talent and their resources and their tech and their processes. So comparing ourselves just to healthcare will never allow the breakthrough. And so healthcare is tremendously underinvested in its supply chain talent and its supply chain infrastructure. And the third piece is probably around leadership preparedness. These organizations in healthcare have grown up over decades, and these organizations are becoming exponentially more complex. And so back to the phrase, what got us here won't get us there, investing in technical skills is necessary, but again, not alone sufficient. The question is, how much time and energy are we putting into leadership development so that we can prepare our leaders for the next generation to take the supply chain forward? And even the leaders that are in those roles today, how many hours or how many days or how many weeks every year are they investing in their own leadership competencies? And if we only invest in the technical competencies, inventory strategies, sourcing strategies, the challenge is that that's not how influence is created. That's not what gets supply chain into the boardroom. That's not what actually changes those first two problems, right? The supply chain leader needs to become far more influential as a leader. And those are leadership competencies, not technical competencies. We're not investing enough time and energy around that.
That makes a lot of sense. Let's dive into that first one for a moment. You mentioned savings. I think one thing we all wonder is, does supply chain truly care about savings?
Right now, so first of all, I've heard that question more from suppliers in the last 6 months than any other time. And I can actually empathize with what it must feel like. Because a lot of supplier organizations from all dimensions of suppliers, from big suppliers to suppliers that are trying to serve supply chain itself, I understand why they feel that way, because they're bringing forward solutions that make sense, saves money. And then they bring it to supply chain, and supply chain finds reasons to say no or not now, which doesn't make rational sense, because if savings matters, then why wouldn't they say yes? And the reality is, it's a conflict. Savings matters more than ever, by the way, just to make sure I say that and be absolutely clear. There isn't anything that matters more to supply chain than savings. That's the only goal, arguably, that most supply chain functions even have, savings. The challenge is that they have thousands of opportunities to save money. So how do you compete for the limited attention credits that they have around the topic of savings? These are organizations that have calendars that are full of savings opportunities, each over $1 million of opportunity and they don't have enough people to get to $1 million plus opportunities. They have backlogs that go for 2 and 3 years of $1 million plus opportunities, and they're short staffed, back to that underinvested topic.
Right.
And so they don't have the resources to get to it. So suppliers that have very, very powerful solutions come forward and say, I can improve your process, I can get you better outcomes, I can improve your service levels, I can even help you with savings. But if it's under that watermark, right, of what the supply chain is currently working on, it's not I don't want to work on it, it's that I've got other stuff that's more valuable right now. So what suppliers have to kind of figure out how to do is, how do you help the supply chain reprioritize your offering back into the top of that 10% of what they can actually get to? Because if it isn't in that kind of top of the food chain stuff that's important to them, it won't matter.
I think that makes sense. And this is the second time that you've now mentioned the concept of attention credits, whether it's for the C-suite or the supply chain. I think one thing I'd ask you is, you mentioned PPI or devices. We talked about purchase services or the indirect. We talked about the labor. What should be their focus from a category perspective? If savings matters, where is the easiest area for them to get that top 10%?
Yeah, that is a really, really great question, and I may give you a response that I think for a lot of supply chain folks might be surprising. I think supply chain folks are primarily focused on the wrong areas. Each category that supply chain folks look at go through generational changes. So can you source and look at a device category 15 times? Yes. Do you get incremental value every time you touch a category? Absolutely. Does it take extraordinarily more significant effort and complexity to get that value every time? Yes. You have to climb higher into the tree branches with more risk. So in these PPI categories or device categories, you're actually starting to take choice away from physicians, which is a very risky thing to do in an organization. And I would even argue maybe even unnecessary, but it's what's happening in a lot of organizations. And there's a lot of tension that's being created in those PPI categories. In contrast, purchase services is a category that is as large as all of PPI combined, right? So that insight alone is something we should just pause, take a deep breath, take it in, right? All of PPI and all of purchase services, about equal category sizes. And all of our attention is going to PPI to climb higher up in the tree branches, while in purchase services, we have generation 1.0 savings sitting on the ground. There's ripe fruit right on the ground for us to pick up, and we're still climbing up in the trees in the really high branches, out on really thin branches, ready to fall off, telling physicians they can't have stuff, when the same value, if not more, can be had with Gen 1 savings in purchase services. That's irrational.
That's interesting. And that's something that I think, all providers can look at, as an opportunity to affect things immediately. Let's dive into purchase services for a minute. Once we are now into that category and the fruit is on the ground, where are some of the places to start picking it up quicker?
Yeah, purchase services breaks into a lot of different categories, and you've got to bundle those categories, just like you do in all the other areas. No one says, I'm just going to go look at pharmacy. They actually break pharmacy into different portfolios. PPI is broken into different portfolios. MedSurg is broken into different portfolios. And likewise, you've got to look at purchase services and break it into the relevant portfolios that make sense. And typically, because the governance structures, you don't need value analysis to do purchase services, not to the same level that you need on the clinical side of the equation. So governance is super important. How do you structure it so that you can actually then tackle it? And you typically design it around how the VPs are organized in the business. So that can be very customer specific. So inside some organizations, you might look at consulting services and say, who ultimately has responsibility for consulting services? It's not going to be one person, but the CFO probably really cares about what dollars are being spent on advisory services or consulting services collectively in the organization. So going to somebody like the CFO and building some momentum around the entire portfolio of consulting and advisory services might make sense. Going to the VP of HR and saying, let's look at contingent labor together, and there's 15 subcategories under contingent labor, might make sense because it's a sub part of labor, but it's contingent labor. So going to facilities management and taking all the facilities related categories of services and putting them together rather than allowing them to be viewed separately and saying, let's look at this together as one group. and then you can put the governance together. But if you look at each category independently, then there's not a lot of momentum to create. By putting them into the right service lines or the right VP service lines, that's how the organizational momentum is created. And not accepting this concept of their sacred cows, don't look at that. In fact, those are precisely the areas to look at, because why are they sacred cows?
Absolutely, and I think we see a lot of the same thing at Medpricer with many of our clients, with categories they can't touch, or basically the alignment around, different portfolio managers managing, different things in those different buckets. So that's spot on.